Well, on the heels of such an esteemed scholar and a mentor of my own, David, I hope that this will follow through. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate everyone coming around. This is really the culmination of about a 4-year project now, and the title is Western Cherokee Ethnoecology Language Revitalization, and I hope to show today the amazing links, the sort of inextricable links between keeping biological, linguistic, and ecological diversity intact. Next slide, please. This is to orient everyone. This is sort of some landscape of the Oklahoma Ozarks and the foothills, and it really sort of shows sort of the subtlety and some of the similarity between the Appalachian region and the Oklahoma landscape, to which the Western Cherokees were removed following the Trail of Tears. And this is where we spent quite a bit of time. It's a result of about 40 years, and we got to know these hills and hollers quite well, largely thanks to the input and collaboration of a trusted group of friends and elders. So listening to our elders, goals of the Cherokee Biocultural Diversity Program, we were asked at the outset to examine what's keeping the language alive in certain places in Cherokee Nation. That is, are there demographic forces at work? Are there cultural forces at work? Kinship factors, etc. And in the 14 counties, we really based our study essentially in one region that I'll show you momentarily. We also hope to document the surviving plant-based food traditions, particularly, and again, the socio-ecological forces that sustain them. Next slide. Cherokee Nation, this is a map to orient everyone, just in case you're not quite familiar. Cherokee Nation is not a reservation per se, it's a sovereign entity. It's 14 counties, and where I work in Fayetteville, there's a nice, it was easy, very fortunate to have a field site that was an hour away, and what I'll show you is the more rugged regions. The Boston Mountains are here, and this is a little bit of an outstretch of the Ozark Plateau, and we'll see some similarities between, some overlap between topographic relief and Cherokee traditional presence. So, in the next slide, I'd like to just mention a few things about the scope of the work. We were hoping to understand how collective plant foraging knowledge can and does inspire cultural growth on the community level. And from the very beginning, the first phone call that I received from Dr. Neil Morgan, he was very attached to and interested in the lifestyles and the foraging patterns and the language use patterns in these communities that are considered rural and traditional and somewhat isolated. But we also hope to explore the functional and the symbolic relevance, but in my case in a much more pedestrian way, I'm afraid, than the way that Dave Kozo just presented. What you'll see is a little more ethnoscience at work. And given the recent interest in food sovereignty, and as this project has evolved, it became evident to me and to all of us on the project, Sean and Roger and Rick as well, that the traditional Cherokees are increasingly interested in ways to keep their own food supply intact. And so in doing so, we found out that there is an interest in greenhouse building and in propagating plants and semi-cultivation, that is the netherlands between plant cultivation and plant foraging. So, and patterns of variation, intercultural knowledge variation became another important theme, and this is really a kind of a summation of this work. So, the next slide. Okay, so in Greasy, Oklahoma, which is the little tiny community right in the center of that Boston Mountain stretch, we found ourselves working every week for 2 or 3 days outside a community building, and this is us working on. I've set a few slides to give y'all some with a little bit of visuality to work with, and here we are working on the beginnings of the greenhouse. And the next slide, I wanted to mention that it was apparent after several semi-structured interviews that the food medicine continuum is very much an important part of Cherokee traditional identity. And the wannabe plant taxonomist in me was keen to see or to look at the sort of the patterns of organization that seem to guide how certain plant families are targeted or selected for use, and why others perhaps are not. And this is just an example of 2 relevant forageable and available plants, dewberry and wild strawberry, both of which are considered important, sort of prized and somewhat elusive given the seasons. And what we'll show in a moment too is the relevance of seasonality. The next slide. The edible flora, if you spend any time with Cherokees, you may know now that wild onions in the springtime is gathering wild onions. It's a symbol of, it symbolizes reverence for one's landscape. It's also has more subtle implications about community and resilience, and watercress gathering, especially on cold, sunny mornings seems to be a good way for people to come back together and to revivify collective traditions. And in this case, this is a trusted friend and a medicine man who's gathering watercress and showing us a little bit about the special characteristics of that particular species. Okay, next slide. Building the greenhouse was interesting because as the project evolved, it moved from a foraging study into the ways that foraging, or that the wild plants may be cultivated. So, and interestingly enough, we found that there are a few species that can be grown, and there are several that cannot. And so it was a lot of fun from an ecological point of view to determine the difference. Next slide.
What were you shoveling here?
Oh, in that case, we're mulching in after having built the greenhouse there. Yeah, sure. And so the three, yes, and in fact, they were, I think, keen to be anthropologists that work with the shovel and mulching. It was a lot of fun for me, and I was able to get quite involved. 3 years in the area gave us enough time to develop rapport. We used open-ended structured interviews, consulted with officials, and Cherokee Nation, and at the same time supplemented this with as much folkloric material and archival data that we could. And the next slide. Here's just a quick sort of overview of an ethnoecology of landscape. If you notice that there is an interesting sort of it's almost like an activity context, to use one of Bill Relay's terms, in which the ways in which people envision parts of the landscape really tell you a lot about how they feel about and think about and envision and conceive of those landscapes. I'll move fairly quickly since I've got a few more slides than necessary. In the next slide. Cherokee language, at the very beginning, we found that according to the 2000 most recent census data we could use, we looked at all of the communities for which we had data and found that when you look at this numerically, there are 2 places, and it's sort of this little arc here and another swath toward the north where the language is still in use. And that is to say, they were interested, that the tribal officials wanted to know where could we go, for example, to explore the survivorship of Cherokee. And it's estimated that maybe 1,000 people speak it on a daily basis, but now the most recent estimates are down to about 600. So the next slide shows the Native American population, which you would expect, is fairly commensurate with the patterns of language use. And so in doing this, we were able to begin to understand where our intention should be focused. And so we spent the majority of our time interviewing and getting to know and befriending the elders who live and work in this area. And this is Greasy, where we spent the majority of our time here. Okay, and remember that pattern, if you would, because it will relate to the slide that comes up on ecological diversity. And then, okay, this is River King. What we found over the course of the study, trusted friend, graduate student Carl Keller here, we found that River King, has an interesting reproductive ecology. And over the course of the work, it was very, very evident that in river cane breaks, as they call them, cane breaks, we find a co-occurrence of a number of relevant species, from wild strawberry to bloodroot to ginseng, which is quite rare now. But the cane breaks are even internally and culturally conceived of as important and relevant and dwindling habitats, riparian habitats too, for plant foraging. And so we started recognizing right away the cultural, ecological, and symbolic relevance of cane breaks from a sort of geographic or a physiographic point of view. In the next slide, what we found was, if you remember, interestingly enough, once we started mapping where river cane breaks are actually distributed across Cherokee Nation, we found an interesting and perhaps not accidental correlation between the presence of Native American communities in higher proportion in this region where Greasy is not here, and then again towards Kenwood in the north. And I was intrigued to see that there was a mappable regional pattern or an overlap or correlation at work, which we should probably be sort of cautious before we put too much stock in this, because it is an evolving work, but at the same time it was an encouraging way to see there could be in fact observable, empirical, actual relationship between ecological and cultural and linguistic diversity, because these are the places where the language is still spoken. Now, why would that be? It's an interesting question, but I don't think it's accidental just yet. And in the next slide, we found that there's a number of pathways that's helping and I should say that are facilitating the continuity of Cherokee cultural traditions generally, with increased financial support, sustained community interest, and efforts on the
part of Cherokee tribal officials to form productive collaborations. And anthropologists have had sort of a checkered history in among Western Cherokee. And this is, for a variety of reasons, for whatever reason, it was up to us to help to sort of revivify some productivity between anthropologists and Cherokees. The barriers are many, and they begin with diminished access. It's not clear to any native Cherokee in this region where to go to forage or how to find the places where edible and medicinal plants can be located. But we also see a term, and this is to borrow from Pelto, delocalization. That is the abandonment of historic technology in favor of more apparently cosmopolitan pursuits. We also see a fragmentation of cultural identity, that is, a widening gap in particular, and this was evident after several interviews, that the elders and the young people especially, although there's a mutual respect, there's not enough apparently interactivity. So language erosion probably leads to ecological knowledge decay, and so as the project has evolved, this has really been the focus as we move forward. And the next slide. We found in 2008 a point of view that was sort of expected, but at the same time served as a kind of a rationale to advance the study. We found that the age of the respondents and the communities that we were beginning to work in Flute Springs and in Bell and Greasy, that the most fluent speakers, and we simply had a self-rating scale between 1 to 7, and to use free listing tasks and plant names in English and in Cherokee, and found that the most fluent speakers, as you would imagine, are the elderly. The intermediates are in between, and then those who speak English only were younger. So that told us how to select and how to begin to identify the respondents that would possibly be the most helpful in this case. So as we move forward, next slide. We found something quite interesting, and this is where the project is now sort of leading us. The proportion of any one respondent or participant's family who speaks Cherokee is not powerfully correlated, but significantly correlated at least, to the number of wild plant foods and applications that they live. So, and not only does one's knowledge of Cherokee seem to provide an indicator of plant knowledge, but it also gives a broader sort of insight into the relationship between ethnoecological know-how and language maintenance. The next slide. Here we are performing, Sean and Kane is working the pile sort task, and here I am recording the responses rapidly, and they had a great time doing this, where you take cards and plants, these were used photos in this case, and later on used voucher specimens to sort all of these sort of core basic 30 plants into piles to see how Cherokees in this regard classify, cognize, and name plants. And the next slide. We'll see that if you subject this material to multidimensional scaling, it wasn't obvious to me what they were. In other words, although it formed an interesting circular pattern right away, I was looking, doing this sort of classic sort of ethnoscientific head scratching, thinking, what's the grand picture here? What's working here? What are these categories? And so we took this back to the community center, and then put it right down. And they said, "Oh, don't you see?" And it was apparent to me until they explained that this was in fact a sort of a map of the seasonal availability of the plants themselves. That is to say, that in the springtime you find a wild onion and bloodroot, and this is not exactly a perfect correlation for seasonal availability and plant classification. But what it does show, for example, is in the later spring, morels, they call them Easter eggs actually, and sort of correlating with its sort of April appearance, and cochani or green-headed coneflower, which is a great edible leafy green. Then from catnip to elderberry to slippery elm, and then moving into the later spring to the early summer, possum grapes, and then later on in the fall, persimmon, sumac, and hickory. And then sassafras, interestingly enough, in the middle, because of the roots being available during any time of the year. So it was with the one plant that they said, "Oh, well, this makes sense. So your fancy techniques apparently do have a bit of relevance." So somewhat encouraging at least to see. So we were in fact interested to find that there was a seasonal component to the situated version of the plant classification. Next slide, please. Another chart that was interesting, we found that if you subject the pile sort agreement scores, and that's a fancy way of saying how much intercorrelation is there between any two respondents' pile sort pattern. And what we found was that the more people agreed with each other, the more information that they were storing in their own minds. And that is to say that there's a sort of a pattern whereby cultural consensus seems to be linked to language retention. And that was a point that we were also interested to discover, and our consultants also provided some good sort of supplemental feedback on this. And in the next slide, we found one other interesting sort of point about the language and its transmission patterns. And this may not be terrifically surprising to some, but what we found was that listening to the grandmothers, and this is a spin-off of the original listening to our elders program, that matrilineal kinship in Cherokee language is relevant. Nearly all the Cherokee speakers in rural Oklahoma were raised, and we found this after successive interviews. We found that they were raised in close proximity to a fluent maternal grandmother. And I was thinking, and head scratching and thinking, oh, well, can we do a Pasquare? And then the odds ratio, remember that from stats course. You can see whether or not there's to what extent you could predict. In this case, we found that Cherokees are 14 times more likely to speak the language if their mother's mother also spoke the language. And at the same time, growing up near a maternal grandmother who was fluent, that only slightly raises one's chances if you use this model. And this was an interesting find, and it gives us some deeper insights into the nature and social fabric of relationships that exist in Cherokee Nation. Okay, after the multiple discussions about cane breaks, it was interesting to me that Sue and Myra asked me to come to their cane break, and these are relatives that live near Bell, and they wanted for me to experience why and how cane breaks matter. And so here we are listening to grandmothers and their renditions and stories about cane breaks and their dwindling appearance across the landscape of Cherokee Nation. In the next slide, the basketry construction. This is just to give you a little bit of visuality. Shauna Kane's baskets here. She's it renders this meaningful when she describes how deconstructing river cane and reconstructing its constituent parts into something meaningful and beautiful is in a way emblematic of Cherokee history itself. And these are all, by the way, dyed with native plants, bloodroot, black walnut, and elderberry, which are also actually found within the cane breaks themselves. So in the next slide, and to summarize, the Cherokee language, wild plant foraging knowledge and procurement patterns, they are generative. And all too often, I think sometimes we make the mistake of seeing cultural patterns in native communities as either being somewhat static or maybe fragmented, but actually we can surmise that they are more generative than not, more dynamic and resilient, and that is that they survive because they resonate in rural Cherokee spiritual and expressive life. And at the same time, Western Cherokee food foraging traditions acquire meaning in two ways, and after multiple discussions with our community group, we just as we're summarized, they would explain that it matters on an emotional level because you develop collective understandings of seasonality. You learn how and where to gather plants by spending time with neighbors, and particularly grandmothers and outdoors. And at the same time, the practicality, the use value, and the plan and the need to understand how to identify, how to procure, how to harvest, prepare, and to consume any food correctly is really a complicated and sort of multidimensional process. So really, the study of foodways in any cultural context is in many ways a systems process with multiple constituent parts. One more slide to conclude. Traditionally, ethnoecological knowledge we believe to be vital to the survivorship of Cherokee culture generally. And it was an immensely rewarding project, and we could even sort of see the work sort of evolve. In fact, ethnobotanical practices we might conclude are cornerstones of adaptive knowledge, and they do seem to serve as expressions of identity and heritage. But as we move forward, the concerns about food sovereignty are yet to be fully addressed, and the traditionalists who live among the Western Cherokees are themselves increasingly concerned about access to where the wild foods grow. So in lots of ways, this is sort of a capstone of an ongoing project that it was designed to present the high points. I appreciate your attention very much.
Any questions for Jeff? Are there any efforts to spread the knowledge and the use of the language?
Yes, and it's interesting because those efforts occur in different ways, on different levels. There's an environmental component that's sort of guided by the Cherokee Nation itself that really doesn't like the word ethnobotany per se, but now they're adopting it, and they're interested in sort of publishing and propagating and sort of disseminating this knowledge. But the other efforts are more community-based. So communities themselves are now coming together on their own weekends and during hog fries and during revivals and pie suppers and potlucks. They'll make an effort sometimes to have a plant walk or to bring in, say, Prunella vulgaris or some other plant, and slippery elm, and talk about it. But it's quite informal on a community level, although it's somewhat more standardized and even being sort of published in brochures and pamphlets by the tribal leaders themselves. So that is encouraging. So good question.
Other questions?
Yeah, what I'm curious about, when you're talking about the loose cane breaks, does that have any relationship to the damming of all those streams and rivers in that area?
It does. It does. In fact, I kind of wanted to get at some point to have a chance to, but obviously not today, to mention the spread of the poultry processing and even small scale farming, but at the same time damming up the Illinois River and Barren Fork Creek. All of these have sort of served to diminish the cane breaks themselves, and this is an alarming concern for the traditionalists to recognize the symbolic relevance of cane breaks. The damming has had a very important effect on
Is the tribe been involved in making decisions about damming, or is it mostly being made by the state?
That's a really complicated issue, and each will tell you that the other is responsible for damming. And so, at least what I found is that that's something of a black box, and I'm not quite sure who's exactly doing it. But yeah, I'd like to know if people to find out. Yes, ma'am.
Were the canes native to Oklahoma before they came, or did they bring them from a past?
Yes, they were. Dave and I talked about this before, and this particular species we know was present. In fact, was present all the way across eastern North America. But I think given farming techniques and clear cutting and so forth, the development and urbanization, they're now just pushed to the very edges of the streams and the rivers, where ironically, ultimately, these traditional Cherokee-speaking communities are located, which is interesting. So.
Any other questions? By some miracle, we're on schedule. I acknowledge the